Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed your cup of tea and coffee, and we're going to start again with a panel discussion. And I'm absolutely delighted to have Amira Kohler with me, who is a CIPD Fellow and a Change and Performance Management Leader, and Patriza Kokot-Blamey, who is author of Gendered Hierarchies of Dependency, book, and is a senior lecturer at the School of Business and Management at Queen Mary, University of London. So thank you both very much for coming. And I wanted to start and talk about performance management. Now, that might sound a bit of an odd point to start at, but actually, Amira's research has identified issues around performance management which really disadvantage women. And I wonder if we could just talk a little bit about how the process is at the moment and how it could be improved.
Sure, okay. Well, I apologise if I get riff on one, because performance management, despite the fact that I've been talking about this, looking at this subject for nearly 30 years, I'm still weirdly passionate about it. And I guess one of the reasons why is because, firstly, every organisation does it pretty well. Often they call it performance appraisal, which is hideous and should not be the name, if anyone still calls it the appraisal, because who wants to be appraised by an all-seeing, all-knowing manager, apparently. But also because it is so disenfranchising, so often, the process that is in place for women and men, to be honest, because most people feel like performance management is a bit like going to the dentist and having to have root canal treatment. You know, it's like, you know, please don't make me do this thing. But it so shouldn't be like that, because it should be a positive and inspiring and coaching type experience. And so,
your issue is it happens once a year.
Well, yes. So, and this is interesting, yeah, because when Marianne interviewed me in advance of this, she said, so let's talk about the performance appraisal. And I said, no, let's not talk about it. because the whole term, even appraisal, suggests what was the old style of doing it, which luckily most people have now realised needed to move on, which was that it used to be a very annual process. It was like you set objectives at the beginning of the year with this theory that it's going to work for 12 months. Never did. And then 12 months later, you come together and the manager is judge and jury and tells you what you've done well, what you've done badly, etc., etc. So it really was set up like an appraisal. And it was, in the past, and I'll come back to this, often because it was an admin process that was designed for ratings and rankings to then affect pay, promotion, who got who went on a training course or a talent development program, etc. So it was an appraisal process for a reason. And we still need to measure, but the point is, where I think the reason why it relates to this whole subject about female empowerment and just generally about equality is that process that was so staccato and kind of you come and look at it again in a year's time is very disadvantageous often for women, because for three reasons. Women are known to underestimate their performance. So if you do a self-rating, as I believe that organisations should do, what is clear is that women will tend to underestimate their own performance, as opposed to men who, sorry to the men in the room, but have a tendency to overestimate. So there's like this sort of deviation of self-perception, which, if it then relates to this idea of objectivity, that we've asked the woman how she believes she's performed, we've asked the often male boss how he thinks they've performed, and that rating then goes into dictate pay and promotion, etc., then women are naturally going to come out of that maybe worse than men. Secondly, women have a tendency to berate themselves and to remember in technicolor the stuff that went wrong during the year and not the stuff that they did really well. And then the third reason is something that Harvard Business Review have done some research on, which is that, which I found really interesting, that apparently women are 1.4% more likely to receive subjective critical feedback than men, as opposed to positive, objective feedback. So what that means, for instance, is the example that they gave was there was a team and two people did exactly the same sort of work, and the woman was described as having analysis paralysis, whereas the man was described as being of having considered thoughtfulness. so it's just an example of kind of a different terminology applied for that will in effect work against a woman. So I guess that my issue with performance appraisals and performance management is that it can be particularly disadvantageous to women without people even knowing. They don't realise that that's inbuilt.
You've argued for continuous performance management, haven't you? And that benefits not just women, but everybody.
Oh, absolutely.
Because there's no point in having a goal that's set 12 months in hence when we know that business is moving so quickly that a goal set in a month's time is going to be outdated.
Well, absolutely. So I'm sure lots of you know that now the more sort of progressive way of looking at performance management is continuous, which means objectives that are much more agile and aren't fancifully meant to fit into a nice 1 year kind of neat timescale. Secondly, ongoing crowd-based feedback that is collated from a range of different sources, so that, for instance, the woman's feedback that might be negative about her own performance, it can be then there's the foil of what did your clients say, what did your colleagues say, what did your direct reports say, what did your overall bosses say, so that there's much more kind of a multi-dimensional view of that. And if you collate feedback at the time, over time, then women will have something to look back at to go, oh yes, I did do that well. So that this technicolor image becomes a bit more balanced, that they remember that good stuff that they did. Someone told me the other day this brilliant idea that women, rather than having a to-do list, ought to have a ta-da list, which is like, ta-da, yes, I remember I did do that. And I thought, I really like that. So yes, I think, and then the other really important subject, a point about continuous feedback, is having ongoing, frequent coaching conversations, because this idea of this hideous appraisal at the end of the year, I mean, you're always probably going to have some sort of final review, because at some point that people do want to know how they actually did. But if they have a much more continuous coaching conversation with a manager who is has some guidance about how to do this conversation in a really constructive way, it will have so many benefits over time.
Thank you, brilliant. Patriza, so a lot of your research has been done, or your recent research, your book has been looking at the different ways that women progress through organisations in Germany compared to the UK.
Yeah, so I'm interested in two dimensions. So I think that actually complements what Amira was just saying quite well. So my research looked at women who made it to the very top of professional service firms, so particularly partners in big accounting firms, and I looked at, and also in smaller accounting firms, I looked at two dimensions. I looked at national context and I looked at firm size. And we know, for example, that women often choose to work for smaller or medium-sized companies because they're hoping to get the flexibility that they feel they need in order to combine their family and working lives. Yeah? But actually what I found in my research was that the more procedural the company, the better women were doing. So women did really, really well in Big Four firms, for example. So if we're looking at just a percentage, in the Big Four companies, we're looking at 23%, where things are really quite proceduralized. You do have this sort of more continuous approach to performance management. And if we're looking at the smaller firms, as well as in Germany, things are much more sort of ad hoc, yeah, and they're much more fluid. And we do know that performance management systems are really very easily subverted. So, for example, in Germany, what was really interesting is that a lot of people tell me, well, you know, these big firms, they have the same approach everywhere. But actually, in Germany, these approaches were sort of brought in through mergers and acquisitions. And what was happening is that the partners that had been in place there, they accepted that these performance management systems needed to be there, but they made it so that they felt that one privilege of their position was that they should work with people they liked. and that was really important to them. And they thought, I think someone actually used the word perverted. They said, I think these performance management, these systems are really perverted. Why should I work with someone that I don't know just because the sort of recruitment process is saying they are better? Why shouldn't I work with someone that I've known for 25 years? And we, of course, know through long history, through long research, that doesn't really work for women. And so I'm really a big fan of very, very proceduralized career systems where you can see, and that was the women that I interviewed, they were at the top of their careers. They had made it. So I didn't talk to women that didn't do that, yeah? And so that was one of the lessons, was that they really did really, really well in thinking strategically about their careers. They were looking at what did people ahead of them do, how is the process working, how many projects of this sort of kind do I have to have in order to progress to the next level, how many partners do I need to get in on my side in order to get there, and they sort of hamstered away at that, yeah? Whereas in Germany, it was much more about relationships. And that's also what we can see in smaller and medium-sized companies, that relationships matter more, where the hierarchies are flatter. And so, yeah, and I think performance management systems also, the civil service actually does this really well. They have a lot of, and women do really well, for example, in the Department for Education and other institutions like this. I think one thing I would say is that we were talking about confidence on my table, and I think that is another thing that procedures can really help with, because we know that women are less likely to ask for challenging projects. They're less likely to put their hand up and say, I can do this, yeah? But we know that if you have a process in place that makes sure that your manager is also responsible for thinking with you about the leadership possibilities that you can, that you should have in order to progress. Yeah, if that is part of the process as well, then that is more likely to happen. Women are more likely. So if you're looking at two companies, and of course, yes, you do want to, the more policies they have, they're more likely to be proceduralized, and we just know that women do better there.
Sounds as though the women who got to the top that you interviewed had managed their careers really well, so they thought step by step about what they needed to do to be there.
Yeah.
Did you feel that they'd got support from their managers to do that, or had they succeeded because they were very clear about how they were going to get from one stage to another?
I think generally what I saw across the two samples is that the women were very strategic. They were quite cool. They were not necessarily entangled fully in their workplace at all times. There's a penalty to leaving in Germany. Yeah, if you're job hopping, if you, for example, find that your line manager isn't supporting you, that is something that is very difficult to get around in smaller, medium-sized companies and in other cultural contexts, for example, in Germany. And so what women did there was they actively tried to move. They moved somewhere where they had the support. But in larger firms, in the big four firms, for example, in the UK, you could, the system, the opportunities are so wide and the processes in place are so rigid that you can work around these sort of people. You can find ways to position yourself without leaving. But in the UK, there's less of a penalty for leaving. So if you find that you're just not getting ahead, and I think that's probably also something to say, that they were quite cool about what they were bringing to the table. And what we find is that performance management systems are often, we think of them as meritocracies, but they're not. And what happens is that when things are going well, everyone is doing well. But when there's especially in nations like liberal states, like the UK, where you're having external circumstances that are changing the context for everyone. You're having a regulatory change, you're having Brexit. Things are getting much more stressful for management. And what happens is that performance management systems are actually a way that management pushes these anxieties back into the people. Yeah? So even if you are told, well, you're not performing well, and then I think what they did really well, the women that I interviewed, was to think, well, am I, or has the context changed? And are you telling me something that actually isn't reflective of what I am, but that is reflective of where the position of the company is, and that I cannot influence because of the context? And they would then be very careful to think, well, can I weather this storm here, or do I need to move? And so that was also something that they worked very well with, and I think I'm moving ahead. I've had a history of talking too fast. But they were very good at maintaining relationships, and we'll talk about this in a minute, I know, with recruiters, which is something that isn't that important in the UK, in Germany, for example. There's a penalty to leaving. In Germany, hopping around isn't as valued, but that can work here. There's still a cost attached, because every time you leave, you have to position yourself again. You have to learn how everything works. It doesn't come for free. Yeah, but if you're finding that actually this is getting really stressful, this performance management system is being used to push the anxieties that the company's having into us, yeah, and it's producing too much stress for me and my family, then in a market where we know companies are having a hard time to recruit as well, you can take steps.
What was really striking? Yes, I was just going to say, go on, Amira.
Sorry, just following up on your point about I think it's fascinating. In Germany, they felt that they had a sort of a right to work with somebody that they liked, who was bound to be someone who was very familiar, who was bound to be another man. And I have this kind of acronym, or whatever you could call it, the ABCD of empowerment. Okay, and it's a simple thing, but it's just, so A is awareness, B is bias, C is coaching conversations, and D is data. I'll explain. So everyone is biased. We are all biased. We don't, it's not, we have had a certain upbringing, we've had a certain background, we all have beliefs, and we all have stuff that we find more and less comfortable. So we're all biased, so we can't change that, but what we can do is change our awareness of our biases and our subconscious bias. And in the workplace, if, for instance, we can educate men or women in authority to say, if what you want to do is work with somebody who is familiar to you, who you like, who you know, then you are likely to be recruiting other people who are just like you. And so we just need to, I think, understand how bias works and be a bit more savvy about explaining, the downside of that, but also with data around that. So, the point about if you are to, forget that. So anyway, so awareness of bias. Secondly, I think the C is coaching conversations. So as we've talked about, if we can help managers to do really good conversations, and some managers are there accidentally. We get quite a lot of accidental managers who really don't do this stuff naturally, and we are, I think, sometimes naive about the fact that you put a manager in a position where they're meant to be bringing somebody else on, and they just don't feel comfortable with it. They don't know what to do. And I know Joy gave some brilliant statistics about, a lot of men want to do well, but they just don't necessarily know what to do for women, for instance. So let's help them. Let's give coaching conversation tips, give check-in, I'm an advocate that check-ins might have different purposes. So you might have a general check-in with your employee, maybe every 2 or 3 weeks, every 6 months, a career conversation. Give them the prompts for that. Give managers tools, guidelines, just make it simple. Let's pretend that this stuff comes naturally to everybody. Really help managers be coaches in the moment, to ask questions, to be curious, so much of that stuff that Joy was talking about. And then the last one, and it's absolutely critical, is to back it up with data. Because if we have a way, and I hope most organisations would by these days, have a way of knowing, for instance, what is the spread of ratings that is being given? Is the spread of ratings biased towards the common ethnic group versus other ethnic groups, for instance, towards men rather than women? Is there an issue for female returners to the workplace? Are they getting lower performance ratings? Are they not being promoted as frequently? If we can back it up with data, most people in authority in organisation, the COOs, the CEOs, the FDs, that's what will persuade them. It's not women kind of like feeling, we're not getting on around here as much as men do, so that kind of thing. It's not, we can all maybe bemoan that, but the data...
Organisations will need to start tracking and
Absolutely.
Recording that data for ESG purposes as well, won't they?
Yeah.
So actually it will start to show the
Absolutely.
Gaps and the cracks in organisations.
Exactly. So I think that's just a little, a little guideline that I tend to try and remember, the ABCD of empowerment. Yes.
Patricia, you interviewed women who'd made it, who were at the top, who were in senior management positions, and yet they communicated to you they felt really insecure, and that they didn't feel they had great job security.
That is in the UK?
Yeah, the UK, yes.
So I think generally, this is why
I wanted to ask, do you think that that's a systemic issue around the culture of work in the UK. Has that got something to do with women themselves and the imposter syndrome? And I wondered if you thought about that.
So I think notably what was different is that they didn't have that in Germany. And I think that it is one of the things that I'm interested in is political economy. And for me, from my perspective, it is a reflection also of the culture we live in. Yeah, we're in a state that is liberal. It discussed when we could see this during COVID, right? When COVID,
saying, just to understand it, you're saying what doesn't happen in Germany is women don't have imposter syndrome. Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is that women are not worried about redundancy. When there's a crisis, an economic crisis, in Germany, that is weathered as a community. Yeah? So the unions, for example, are part of the organization. They have to work towards a solution with the organization. Yeah? And so then everyone will be working a bit less. Whereas in the UK, we see redundancies. And that was also, that came through in their talks. Even women that had made it to the very top were earning six-figure salaries. Some of them had been made redundant, even at partner level. Some of them had, been quite stressed about redundancy rounds. And so what it showed to me is that they were very resilient and they were very cool about their work. They understood that actually work is something where you can accomplish a lot and you can do a lot. You can really make a difference to yourself and how you see yourself. But it is also a place of great stress for some people at certain points in time. And that is what I'm talking about with this performance management. When things are going well, it's going well. But when things are going bad, sometimes this can be used to be pushed back into people. Yeah, and then as a woman, what you want, you're more vulnerable. We know that during recessions, women are more vulnerable, even in these top positions. And then they were basically, through the performance system, told that they had done it to themselves. And that is the problem. Yeah, and so then you need to be really cool about it and understand that actually this is not a reflection of me. This is the system that I'm in, and I need to actively work myself out of this system.
So why, Amira, do you think allyship is so important, and what is it that some practical steps that we can do?
Sure. Well, I think let's think about allyship probably at three different levels. So the individual level, organisational level, and maybe institutional level. So at an individual level, I mean, we've talked about it a bit so far on the tables. It's absolutely critical that women are able to discuss with other women tips and tricks that they have learnt to get on and to put on an armour and to kind of shore themselves up for the kind of conversations that might be challenging, like a conversation where you're going to you have your annual performance review and you suspect that you're going to need to kind of really go into this very strong and very very aware of your own strengths. And I've facilitated workshops where women kind of prepare each other, do role plays where they actually have the conversation about how am I going to show up in this conversation? How am I going to, when given vague feedback about, analysis paralysis or whatever it might be, how am I going to, in the moment, push back and not do the thing that I might do, which is naturally to go, right, okay, yeah, I hear you, But actually to say, I'd really like an example of that, and I need to understand more about that, and not to be aggressive or defensive, but just to be in the moment and very sort of.
So do you mean
curious.
That would be a formal kind of training, or is it something that women can do?
It's something that it could be formal. It was quite formal at my organisation because it was quite a big organisation, but it could be just women getting together with other women, knowing there's that promotion round coming up, or there's a pay discussion coming up. Women are terrible about negotiating their own worth, their own self-worth. So yes, it could be formal or it could be just very informal. And
what about allyship with men? Because if we're trying to be more inclusive, how do we ensure that the conversation and the relationships at work continue between women and men as well as women and
well,
women?
absolutely. Well, I think the next stage, once women kind of feel that they've had this conversation amongst themselves, is then to do the really good thing, which is to invite men to find out why the women needed to have that conversation, and to say, and now let's have that conversation together as to what how it feels sometimes for us. What do you think is going on? Do you perceive that there is any difference? Because I think so much of this, and this point about the awareness of bias, is it's just noticed, it's not kind of called out, and it's not, what was the expression that Joy said? It was really good expression about call men in, not call men out.
Call men in, yeah.
Well, that was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And yes, right. And I think if men are then, invited to just, not with why are you doing this to me, but what's your view of what's going on? Because we have this view, but do you think that's true? Do you think that's fair? And being curious. I love that, that word about
curiosity,
it. So that's kind of at the individual level. I think at the organisational level, the power of senior people, particularly senior men, to show fairly,
You've
a
got
public
a good
display.
example of this. Do you want to share that story?
Yes,
it's a very powerful story.
A COO that I know of a fairly small organisation, but a very dynamic and fast-growing. It's actually a tech company, and he wanted to bring in a very senior lawyer, but it's a small company. He didn't have the budget for a 5-day-a-week job at the level that he wanted. So he thought, right, I'm going to go and headhunt a female returner that he knew, basically, vaguely, who he knew wanted to work part-time, and that he would be able to get the senior person, but only at 60% of the she wanted to work 60%, and she wanted to work term time only, part-time, and to make it a 60% over the year. And interestingly, when I was talking to Jenny about this, Jenny said, oh, that clever man. He's probably just realised that he can bring in a woman who is so desperate to come back to the workplace, pay her 60%, but actually knows she'll do 100%. So the other part of this story is that he knew that she would think that. So he was determined that was not going to happen. So she monitors her hours. I mean, you kind of do that as a lawyer. You've sort of been brought up doing that. She monitors her hours. Every 2 weeks when they have their check-in conversation, they check out whether she's gone over and whether the workload is realistic. He is incredibly vocal in the organisation to other men and the few senior women that this can work, that it's a win-win for the organisation. They've got the much more senior person than they would have done had they got a 5-day-a-week person. So it's just an example of, I guess, kind of just
flexibility in working
exactly,
practices,
and being a bit more
creative.
Because I mean, one of my personal little bugbears is I want to have a portfolio career. I want to work part-time. I want to have a really good, fulfilling work life. On LinkedIn in 2024, you cannot ask for part-time work. There is no toggle for that. You can say you want contract work,
something to take
remote work. There's nothing to say part-time. It's like, how can that be? I mean, it's so weird.
Patricia, can I ask you a final question about combining parenthood with work, and what tips or experiences you found amongst the women who were successful in doing that from your research that you could pass on?
So I have to say that, so in the UK, so in Germany, one of the ways to becoming a partner was not to have children, which is of course, and that's part of the reason why there's such a low number, because it is the price too high to pay for a lot of people, right? I mean, women, we know a lot of people want children, and it brings life satisfaction over the course, and we there's a lot of research about that, about the social relationships it brings to you as well. In the UK, a lot of them had women, the majority did have children, and again, there were two ways of going about it. The ones in the bigger firms were very good at, again, using the procedures. Yeah, actually, if you're going to a big company, they have procedures in place, and they usually understand, line managers are better at understanding how this works. Yeah, in smaller firms, they often don't understand that line managers are actually in charge of signing off flexible working requests, for example. Yeah, so you can find a lot more sort of bewildering examples of that in smaller. So one of the partners was working with literally a newborn on her feet, for example. Yeah, that was then flexibility, but of course that can be quite difficult if you have a difficult birth or similar. But to be honest, These are women that are very much at the top of their careers, and unfortunately, for most of them, what they did, no, not unfortunately, but it leaves the problems intact, which is that they had a gender reversal in the home. So the husband would be in half of the cases where children were present, the fathers were actually the main caretakers of the children.
So that
is the problem with this. Well, yes, and the problem with this is, well, it is allyship, but it leaves the gendered, it leaves it intact, yeah? It doesn't challenge the organization to change anything, because actually what we know now is that women's and men's salaries are very much on par until it comes to that point that the woman has her first child and she becomes a mother. And the problem, and we know that if a woman is able to pass the baby to someone and work as if she was a normative father, you can expect a very similar outcome. And similarly, if you have a man who takes, we see this now more, we have a bit more data now, we know that men who take shared parental leave are not that welcome. Yeah, it also costs them. So for companies, what we need to change is this ideal worker image, yeah, that the worker who is completely committed doesn't have anything else. We know that there's another 1 million people missing in the workforce now because of long-term illness. We have a staffing and recruitment crisis. And at the same time, we are told we cannot step out of the workplace, even for just a little while, or for Fridays to pick up our children. We're told this.
So
and I think
a call for organisations to be more flexible, to think more holistically about their workforce.
Well, I think for the women, if I'm talking to individual women, I would say that, well, you've got two options. If you're in a large firm, you have to look around at the policies that are in place and make use of them. Apply for flexible working requests. Do talk to recruiters. We know that recruiters do really good work here in the UK, not so much in other countries where that might be looked down upon. But also careers are really long games. Yeah? We're expected to work 45 to 50 years. Yes? One of the key things that results in gender disparity is leaving your work. Leaving a big company to take a job that is below skill level in order to secure the hours that you feel you need. That will be the worst that you can do, because it is very difficult to reverse. But if women can somehow be allowed to keep their foot in the door, that usually you can make it up later. Yeah? If you're still in place, it is something over the next 30 years, you can still get back to the stage where you were and beyond and hamster away. Yeah? But it is because many women are not offered part-time work. We're told that it is impossible for clients to somehow manage. It's almost like clients are fantasized as a baby. They cannot do without you. The baby can stay at home without mommy, but the client cannot possibly cope. And so that is that is very strange. It's very strange. We must resist.
So maybe just a final point.
Okay. So I think there's an institutional, I try and urge companies that have any sort of, kind of lobbying power to try and also argue for better paternity pay, to paternity leave, because in the UK, statutory paternity leave is 1 or 2 weeks. And the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, so this is not like some little blogger, this is a pretty significant organisation, has found that countries with more than 6 weeks of paid paternity leave have a 4% smaller gender wage gap and a 3.7% smaller labour force participation gap than countries that have, less than 6 weeks, and we only have 1 to 2. And the research by the Centre of Progressive Policy think tank report estimates that closing the gender employment gap in all UK local authorities would boost GDP by 1%, increasing economic output by £23 billion. So this is not kind of just nice to have. This isn't just let's get a few men to, kind of help their female partners who've just had babies. This is economically sensible. It's such a significant thing for mental well-being. We've talked about that, for allyship, for understanding. It just has so many advantages. So I alongside individual allyship, organisational allyship, I think institutions ought to behave like allies as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both. Really appreciate all your insights.